So we'd like to start off the keynote sessions with Shaun Connolly, Vice President of Hortonworks Corporate Strategy. And Shaun's going to speak with us about what is the Hadoop opportunity to power the next generation of data architectures. So welcome, Shaun.
Thanks, Rob. Thank you. Hadoop Summit is here. It's been a long time in the planning. I'm very excited. The assembled agenda is fantastic. Opt into what makes sense for you, make the most out of the event. As Rob pointed out, I'm going to really focus on a broad look at how Hadoop fits into broader data architecture to really power next generation solutions, whether they're analytics or transactional solutions. So we'll spend the next 30 minutes or so on Hadoop's role in that and the opportunity. It's not given. There's a lot of work that's left to be done. So I like to start things off on, in my past, I've been sort of in the open source space at JBoss and Red Hat and SpringSource and others, and I've seen really exciting waves of IT influence and change across the industry. We're really at the forefront of something special. I know sometimes out in the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, it's easy to take some of this innovation for granted. But for folks across the country, I happen to be a Philly guy, tell by the accent. So it's really exciting opportunity to be involved in sort of this big data wave. So each of us in this room has a role. And make the most of it, enjoy it, right? Because these types of waves, I've talked with industry analysts in the past, and many of them are really excited about the wave of change that's happening because it's just exciting from a customer perspective, from an industry perspective. So enjoy it, because sometimes these things, they pass by and you don't make the most out of it. So the backdrop is really big data, right? And everybody sort of has definitions, if you will, of big data. There was a recent sizing of the big data market, if you will, from Bank of America and Merrill Lynch. They updated their report on the total addressable market opportunity. In 2010, the report said it was 66 billion total big data opportunity. They've upped it to 100 billion. Again, this is potentially how much stuff you can fit in the glass. It's not a guarantee of sort of revenues driven through solutions in the big data market, but it's the total addressable market. And Hadoop's slice of that big data puzzle has been sized at around 14 billion. So it is really critically important. This is a critical area. It has the opportunity to drive fundamental change. Now, as far as definitions of big data go, they're sort of the classic volume, velocity, variety, right? I figure there's going to be a lot of data science, mathematical folks here at the conference. And so when I think of big data, I think of big data as really a simple equation. And I actually include transactional data in the scope of big data processing, and I'll allude to why later on. You can't have big data just sitting in its own silos, right? You want to make sure you're able to connect some of this new stuff with some of the existing stuff. So transactions plays a role. Interactions, right? Social interactions, website interactions, user-generated content, how people are interacting. That all fuels big data, and there's some insights that can be gleaned out of that. And then the third piece I categorize as observations. So observational data, sensor data, right? The Internet of Things, devices, aircraft engines. They're throwing off all sorts of observational data. That, gaming machines in the casinos, all sorts of observational data from those machines. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that maybe individually might have low marginal value, but when you start aggregating and mixing it, you can actually create much higher potential value. So that's sort of the broad opportunity. And when I think of big data, I like to cast the net very widely across transactions, interactions, and observations. For the visual thinkers, so that was the left brain, right? The mathematical thinkers. For the right side, right brain thinkers, the visual thinkers, I've sort of put together a simple infographic that categorizes things. So you have your ERP and CRM and some of your transactional stuff. You have web applications and web logs and information you might be collecting from A/B testing and search marketing and things like that. And then you also have all the sensor data, RFID data. So when I think of transactions, interactions, observations, this kind of gives you an example of how all that stuff can fit together and what the different types of data are, right? So video, audio, right? Analyzing video for behaviors in the video, very interesting opportunities with that. One of the things, and I'll talk a little bit about some of those use cases in a little bit. One of the other things I'll point out on this slide is business data feeds, right? So people, when they think big data, they're like, well, how do I deal with the big data that's in my enterprise? I think it gets really, really interesting when you start expanding your thinking to outside the enterprise, right? So if you're doing mortgage risk analysis in financial services, wouldn't it be cool to mash that up with information that comes out of Zillow from a real estate perspective and demographic areas of the country and what might be higher risk or lower risk? That's one example. In the video that we had earlier, there was the predictive policing example. So that takes crime statistics as well as publicly available demographic and other data, brings that together. And there's a lot of local and state governments that are doing predictive analytics so they can better head off crime before it happens, right? And that's leveraging, in many cases, part of the open data initiative of the government, publicly available data sets to help them really come up with better models on getting ahead of crime before it happens. So the possibilities are endless when you start thinking about externalizing it. And then finally, if you as a business are uniquely collecting a lot of data, the honeypot of data, if you will, that you might be collecting, there might be new business models where you can actually make that available and drive new revenues out of that, right? So again, big data, a lot of possibilities on collecting it for your own purposes, but opening up new business models. So with that as backdrop, Hadoop lies at the heart, it's the epicenter, but there's a lot of work to be done to ensure Hadoop plays a key role in these next generation data architectures. This is not a given, it's still early in the cycle. There's a lot of work to be done, right? And so that's what I'm going to focus on for the remainder of the presentation. As I mentioned earlier, I've been in the open source space, early days JBoss in 2004 and Red Hat and others, and the power of community, as Rob pointed out, is key. But my definition of community extends beyond just the open source development community. It needs to factor in input, either directly or indirectly, of the end users of the technologies, right? As well as the vendor ecosystem so that more complete solutions can be built. So the technology can actually get across that adoption curve into more complete solutions and get up that sort of crossing the chasm curve, which Jeffrey Moore will cover tomorrow. He'll cover that in a little more detail. But the vendor ecosystem is critically important as well because it leverages the technology for very specific use cases, and that's critically important. So I'm going to put a list of 5 things on here, and my ask of you is to pick at least one of them for an area that you'll drill into in order to help us work together to sort of make Hadoop into what it can be, right? The first 2 are really open source oriented. So if this is to work, we need to be diligent stewards of the open source process and the open source core. We have to be respectful of that process. If we are not, we're just going to diminish the potential that Hadoop or other open source projects can have. And if I've learned something in my experience, that's critical, right? Because the foundation of everything really lies on not only the foundation, but also the innovation that can happen in and around that open source model. So let's be tireless innovators around that core, right? So build on top of that new and interesting ways of visualizing data, accessing the data, transforming the data. There's a lot of white space out there, greenfield opportunity for innovation to happen above this. And then to Rob's point earlier, he said, Hadoop can play a strong role in next generation data architectures. So we need to start thinking of it as a platform, not just a sort of an assembly of individual technologies. And platforms need, in the case of the data space, robust data services and open APIs so that people can integrate with it in very predictable ways, right? That will enable an ecosystem of open source as well as commercial vendors to build and integrate deeply with the technology, and enable it all, from every layer of the stack, the infrastructure on up through the applications, right? And then make the platform enterprise ready and easy to use, which is a bit at the heart of Jeffrey Moore's discussion. I know Eric from Hortonworks will be also touching on balancing innovation as well as stability, but making sure we continue to make this thing easier for enterprises to use for the next wave of adopters. Let me just touch on the open source process a little bit by sharing an article I read recently on SD Times, where they listed the top 10 influencers of the past decade. And you see the normal cast of characters that are up there. Of course, Apple's had a big impact, right? I spent a few years at VMware as part of the SpringSource team when I joined there. They have a rabid user base, a very excited user base. If you've ever been in any of the VM worlds, they're huge, and the people are really excited about using the technology. So key parts of these 10 influencers is they tend to have a very strong passionate community of users. The top open source entity, if you will, out of that list, there was Linux and Eclipse and others, is the Apache Software Foundation. They've been diligent stewards of creating enterprise useful technologies, whether it's the web server, Tomcat, et cetera. I have a lot of experience with a lot of those technologies. They do a great job of stewardship and making sure that open source can flourish in an open way. And so that's key to Hadoop's success. And so when I think of this open source innovation and stewards, I think of it sort of like a tree of life, if you will, right? It might be a corny analogy, right? But I think it's, a tree as it's growing and leaves start coming on it, it needs a stable base. It needs a stable foundation, and it needs to be nourished, right, with new innovation so it can continue to grow. And at the base of that is Hadoop, right? And I think two key steps that the Hadoop community have taken recently, particularly around the turn of the new year, was to begin to declare very concrete lines of development that the broader community, vendors and enterprises can sort of build upon, right? So Apache Hadoop 1.0, very stable release. The version numbering before that from a middle or late adopter, .19, .23, a lot of the version soup, basically communicates to enterprises, I don't know what's going on, and it causes a lot of confusion and a lot of consternation, right? So if it's ready for enterprise, we need to basically say 1.0 is ready, 2.0 is where the innovation, the next wave of innovation is happening, and let's rally a lot of the open source technologies and solutions to be able to opt into whatever branch is appropriate, right? So stable foundation is key. And then you have, sort of the whole, ecosystem of, well-known open source technologies that sit on top of that, Pig, Hive, et cetera. As well as others that are increasingly being used along with Hadoop. And again, this is really more innovation that's happening. For sakes of Keynote, I clearly did not include all of the open source projects that are going on. You will hear about many of these, but others that are going on, and I encourage you to sort of learn more about the innovation that's happening. This tree is continuing to build. It's really exciting. So if those first two steps of diligent steward innovation is what your shtick is about, opt in. Let's try and really drive this towards something that can be all it can be. Now transitioning over into really more enterprise viable, enterprise consumable. A show of hands in the audience, how many were at last October's New York City Hadoop World event? All right, so a pretty decent showing. I'm an East Coast guy, so it was just a train ride up, so it was very convenient. One of the keynote speakers was Larry Feinsmith from JPMorgan Chase, right? And they had really cool use cases that are going on. I've worked with JP at prior lives in open source. They embrace open source technologies very widely, loves the innovation. But one of the key points, and I'm paraphrasing them here, is integrating Hadoop with existing IT investments is critical for its success, because they've already made massive investments in some of their infrastructure they already have, and they will understand how Hadoop can integrate effectively with those, right? So the innovation needs to continue, but how do they maximize the value of that big data by sort of integrating it with some of the other systems they have, right? And that's really the remainder of this session that I'll cover is how do you connect those transactions, those interactions, and those observations into a model, into an architecture, if you will, that enables data to flow in a virtuous cycle, if you will, that enables you to get maximum value out of that. And so one of the diagrams I use, and I have sort of 3 major sections of that, but it starts off with, you have your business transactions and interaction system. So when I was at JBoss, there's a lot of technologies in there, application server, web applications, in-memory data grid stuff, transaction processing, integration stuff that happens in that space. Very familiar. I was in the database archiving and sort of analytics space. So you have your BI and analytics ecosystem, and you have your classic ETL processing. That doesn't go away in the big data world. It becomes more focused on what it does, because you still need to operationalize many scenarios. Right? Then you have the new wave of data, right? Multi-structured data. Some call it unstructured. I don't like unstructured because there's XML files and other things. So it's really multi-structured. Even video files and images have a structure to them that you can analyze and figure out some things from. But you have all of that, and I've sort of categorized this other system as a big data refinery. Think of it as a great place to onboard all sorts of raw input and preserve its original format. Having been in the database archiving business, being able to preserve the original format of something is actually quite useful, not only for audit purposes, but also if you want to improve your algorithm processing of videos, being able to go back against the original video to improve those algorithms. Or one of the use cases I heard was there's a shot spotter, shots fired technology in the crime area where it's taking audio feeds and figuring out where the shots fired are in the city, right? And deploying police as closely as possible to that. So you want to factor out, cars making exhaust noises and stuff like that out of that. So you want to improve those algorithms, right? So you always want to rerun it against a lot of the audio, if you will. So you have your big data refinery. If you just leave that as a stovepipe, right? You could do sentiment analysis on the left, but what about the behavior that leads to the transaction, right? That's what the step 3 is let's connect those worlds so we could begin to blend the behavioral semantics with the transactional semantics so we can actually understand the behavior, right? And get better at encouraging the things that will drive more business, right? If you just had it previously, then you have social sentiment, and people don't like what they're doing, but you don't know why, you don't know how to drive more business out of it. Relatively uninteresting, right? And then you have feedback loops out of this, where you retain runtime models, historical data. So 10 years of Black Friday data, dump it back in, mash it up with 10 years of weather data. So you can better predict for this year's retail season based off of these weather patterns, how should we prepare for the next coming selling season? That's some examples of how it all fits together. From a technology perspective, Apache Hadoop, I think, acts as a fantastic data refinery. That's not its only use case, but I think it's a sweet spot of a use case. Shipping that data around really is done by a lot of the data movement technologies, getting it in, getting it out, those types of things. So that's important. In the BI and analytics space, you have your data warehouse, your MPP stores, your NewSQL stores. My definition of NewSQL in the analytics space, I tend to like to use example. You have Teradata and Aster and Vertica and others who kind of fit into that category who are sponsors. In NewSQL, SAP's HANA, I would categorize as NewSQL for analytics, right? It's a scale-out SQL database. It's not traditional. On the transaction space, you have SQL, NoSQL, the MongoDBs, the key value stores, right? HBase fits into this category. NewSQL fits in transaction processing. So when I was at VMware, there's a product called SQLfire, which is a memory transactional store. VoltDB has one. There's examples of NewSQL for transactions. So there's a wave of innovation happening across data, even beyond Hadoop is the point. And Hadoop can feed into those systems, and it also has things like Hive and HBase that are relevant to those 2 major areas, right? And then there are others, partners here, the data mirrors of the world and others who extend that out and have native solutions in the analytics space and that kind of stuff. So I encourage you to check out some of the show floor stuff. So a lot of arrows on that last diagram, right? How do you move data around? Well, data services, thinking of the platform as a service with service endpoints and service interfaces, and open APIs is key. And stabilizing those APIs is important as well, right? So there's still a lot of work to be done there to make that happen, but that's the exciting part. Once it starts hooking up very deeply, you can really drive some very interesting use cases. So you want to have data services that enable you to take raw Hadoop data, inconsistent or even non-existent metadata, right? And you want to be able to lately bind schema, right? So you can structure it in a way, define a database and tables from a Hadoop perspective, and enable that data to be accessed via other systems as if it's just a set of tables, right? And you want to do that generally. Right now, people use Hive as that way of doing it. HCatalog is the sort of metadata service out of Hive generalized. So you can actually write pig scripts that leverage the metadata in interesting ways. And I'll demo a little bit of what I mean by that shortly. So providing consistent data models across tools, so the result of pig jobs can actually create output that's easily usable by Hive, or the Teradata folks actually have this SQL H integration, which leverages the HCatalog technology to pull data into Aster and downstream systems very efficiently. So this is sort of a critical area. I encourage you, if you're interested in that, attend Alan Gates and other sessions that are happening on HCatalog. Really a fundamental component on data sharing effectively and efficiently. And then having a set of RESTful APIs on that you can actually write script language, JavaScript, or what have you, to access that and orchestrate it. So with that, data services and open APIs sort of in action, I wanted to give you a little sort of taste test of a use case. I'll show a sort of a brief cooking demo. It's really more of an appetizer. If you want the full course meal deal, you go out on the show floor in the Dev Cafe. What I'm about to show you is fully functioning. You'll be able to interact with it on your own. So I'm just going to give you enough taste and smell of the juicy meat, right? You got to go check it out yourself later on. Or cheesesteak, as I like to say, from Philly. I can almost taste it now. My example is a 4-step process. Where we're taking weblog files and getting them into HDFS via these open APIs. Typical structured data, customer data, onboarding that along with its schema information. Isn't it handy if you have already a schema-ified set of data, getting it into Hadoop and bringing the schema along for the ride, so you can use that when you're writing scripts to parse that stuff. HCatalog kind of facilitates some of that. Then there's a pipeline of processing and analysis that can go on, where you can join and aggregate and do all the cool stuff that you can do with some of the technologies on Hadoop, and I'll cover that. The interesting business output of this, however, is this use case comes in on, I'm interested in analyzing my website visits by the type of end results, right? So the type of end results in this case are how many resulted in a transaction and bought something, drove revenue, and 12% of the pie is revenue. How many abandoned their shopping cart, 15%. The other pieces of the pie are more interesting, and the results of the analysis that you kind of see the power of the platform is, the big part of the pie, which is a surprise in this data, is deeply engaged users who have clicked through on more than 4 pages on the site and didn't put something in their shopping cart or didn't buy anything. And it's sort of like, all right, you're on the site getting value. How can I convert you into a customer, right? So 15% abandoning shopping carts, interesting to solve, but that one, driving more revenue, is probably more interesting to solve. So with that, let's head to the demo kitchen, so to speak. I will not do my Julia Child imitation because flesh wounds are painful, but I will do my Guy Fieri for those of you who like it, because the spotlights are pretty intense here, right? So again, I'm just going to briefly go over what I just walked through, and the visual representation, if you will, of this is through Talon's Open Studio for Big Data. It could be other tools that integrate with this as well. I'm just using this as an example. It provides a drag and drop system for connecting over here to get your Apache log data, bring it into a Hadoop, to get your Oracle connection, and here's the connect strings down here, And there's a whole sort of palette, if you will, of components that you could drag on there, configure them, and it'll generate the code. So for the people who don't want to write low-level code, they can use this higher-level tool in order to do it, right? So that gets the data into the platform, right? Then the next step is to set up, ultimately, your database and your tables in HCatalog, get that metadata going. So the first couple of steps are really around HCatalog, database create, and the create tables. And then you sort of have this pipeline, if you will, of loading the data into PIG, right, parsing the log file input, sort of aggregating it, if you will, with the customer information in order to figure out what category they fall into, and then structuring it at the end in a, the HCat store method, right, which will format it in a way according to your schema so it's easily consumed as table data on the output, right? So late bind that schema at the end of the process, right? And then finally, we have sort of the output of the data where we take that HCatalog input and we might do a simple CSV conversion, right? So you could bring it into Excel or what have you, or your BI visualization tool of choice. And out of that process pops really more of a, an analysis of that information, all that log data and customer data, so you can actually see the visits by type, right? And part of this process is, whoa, deep search on my site, 68% are not transacting. How, from a marketing campaigns perspective, how can I drive, move that purple 68% into the blue 12% revenue drivers, right? And that's really an interesting sort of business value use case, if you will. So it makes sense. We'll head back. I'll finish up the slides. I know I'm running late. Sorry, John. He's staring at me going, get off the stage. So we swap back to the slides, please. Awesome. So I'm going to close out on this big data architecture as you should think of Hadoop as really the center of a bigger puzzle that's being assembled. And I'll let Guy Fieri go back here. And there's layers of the stack from infrastructure and systems management on up through data management, movement, integration, up through applications, the business tools to create those applications, the development tools, right? So you want to enable up and down that stack, if you will. And of course, Hortonworks and Cloudera were really a large part of the stewardship, if you will, as well as others in the community. So from people who are sponsoring the event, we're sort of playing that sort of middle space. For a bunch of the other sponsors in that infrastructure and systems management space, you have a whole set of the other sort of sponsors that fit into that category, whether it's operating system virtualization, management monitoring, et cetera. That's all important sort of technologies and integration work that needs to happen. Then you have sort of that middle tier of data management movement, tools that help do ETL and things like that. And at the top, you have the applications, business tools, and dev tools. So when this slide was actually constructed, I was excited to see the even distribution across the layers of the people sponsoring this event. What that tells me is there's a vibrant market that's forming around Hadoop. So it's at every layer, right? So there's interest at every layer, which means it will be an important technology if we execute on some of the things I talked about. Closing out, if we sort of go up the stack from solution architectures, our platinum sponsors have sessions dedicated to solution architectures and use cases that they're enabling, right? So at the infrastructure space, moving data around, clearly important, right? So Cisco will talk really technical about how they're doing, optimizing sort of the networking layer so Hadoop can function, optimally. Stack IQ's been in this, space of, high-scale computing for a while, and they've come up with a management monitoring solution for Hadoop that makes it really easy to provision and deploy it and manage it. Savvis is an enterprise IT where they bring compute, storage, networking, and they've been working with their partners on creating more vertically focused solutions that they can offer to the enterprise, and they'll be talking about some of those. So if you're interested in that, I suggest that. VMware, not only at some of the stuff which Eric will cover in his keynote around enabling high availability and things like that at the sort of infrastructure and Hadoop layer, but also the Spring guys are making sort of the programming model easier for Java developers, and that's important. IBM clearly has solutions across the gamut, And Jim Kobilius in the front row from IBM is just one of the many folks who, at IBM, will be can talk intelligently about a lot of the things they're doing. They've been doing it for a while. Microsoft is interesting in that bringing Hadoop to Windows Server and on Azure, I think we've been very sort of public about it. One of the use cases I find really interesting is how do you light up the information workers, right? The people using the BI tools, Excel, things like that, right? And an interesting use case could be data refinery into their Power Pivot data store that's served up through SharePoint. And then Excel users just opt in and connect to that data store through SharePoint that's just regularly updated on a scheduled basis. The end user information worker using Excel is kind of oblivious to the fact that Hadoop might be powering that, right? And that would be the end result is the business users shouldn't have to know Hadoop is necessarily under the hood, right? So that's a goal that we can go for. MarkLogic XML serving, so ingesting large volume of XML files into MarkLogic server, as well as sort of storing that for long-term retention. I was at MarkLogic World where they were talking about some of those scenarios, and they'll cover that. Vertica definitely in the MPP space. I believe they're talking about some very targeted solutions at specific industries, among other things. Splunk, definitely a lot of log file management. There's a nice, interesting use case for long-term retention of log files and architecture that could be put in place to accomplish that. Teradata, Scott now will be coming on stage to talk a little bit about Teradata's perspective. And then I'll close out on jokingly the granddaddies of the people who started integrating deeply with Hadoop from a vendor perspective early on. Datamir, one of the sponsors, provides really more of an information worker spreadsheet and visualization on top of native Hadoop. And they have some new release that they've come out with. And I'd like to end on a good note of Karma with the KarmaSphere folks, where they've actually come up with an environment where you can share your analytics and have team access to a variety of these analytic functions at a higher level so business analysts and others can create ultimately what will execute as Hadoop jobs under the hood, but in a much more user-friendly and collaborative way. So a lot of really interesting use cases that are going on, so I encourage you to check out some of the sessions that are out there. One of the purposes of this event was solution architectures and what use cases can be enabled, right? And so that's really what they're tasked with talking about. And I'm going to close out with a repeat of my 5 points, right? But I want to ask that you buy in to a North Star, if you will, of here's where we're going. And I always like to have a quote or something that you're going towards, right? An aggressive goal. I really firmly believe more than half the world's data will be processed, touched, might not be stored, but touched or processed in some way by Apache Hadoop, right? And in order to do that, you need open APIs and all the stuff that I talked about, right? And so we can argue about whether that's 2015, 16, or 17. Some of the industry analysts push back on the timing of that. But I like aggressive goals, right? So let's keep it aggressive for now, and that'll help us make the right choices for this stuff on 1 through 5, right? So I totally blew out my time, but hopefully you found that useful. What I'd like to do now is hand things over to Eric Baldishweiler, CTO of Hortonworks, where he's actually going to cover Hadoop Now, Next, and Beyond and give you a feel for where the open source technologies are headed. So, Eric? Yeah.